Here is the application up and running, and I have some basic functionality in place. Although most of the security related code is not filled out as yet, that's what we're going to do. You can see I have basically a blank template in the code behind the browser. But the opening page of the application has a button here where I can click to see the secret recipe. Unfortunately, when Angular makes that request, the response will always be 401 unauthorized, because we need to get the user an access token before Angular can get the data for the secret recipe and put that into a model so we can display it in this view. I already have the login form put together. That's in a template that forms part of my navigation. This template puts the login controller in charge of that section of the UI. Hopefully, what I want to achieve eventually is that when the user is logged in, the login controller will display hello username. Otherwise, when the user is still anonymous and doesn't have an access token, we'll display this login form. When the user clicks the submit button on this login form, we will call a login method that is defined inside of this controller. And all this method is really going to do is take the username and password that were entered into the form and pass them along to this OAuth service, which is not implemented as yet. Currently, it just returns an empty object. So if we are given a username and a password to a function called login, what would that function look like? Well, login would be a function. It takes the username, it takes the password, and ultimately, what I have to do is do an HTTP post to the /login URL. We could make that a configurable parameter for this service, but I will just leave it hard-coded for now. And when we do this post, we're going to have to pass along some data, which will include the username and password. So I need an object that has a username property and a password property. Those are initialized to the incoming parameter values. And then because this is OAuth 2, I need to specify a grant type. Now, I don't want to drill into all the intricate details of the OAuth 2 specification, but I will tell you there's several different grant types available. And the grant type that we want for this scenario, where I'm passing a username and password, I want a grant type of password. And all the OAuth 2 servers everywhere, if the username and password are correct, and I put that data correctly into a post, then the server should respond with an access token for me. However, there's one additional little step that I need to take to put this data into the correct format. The OAuth 2 specification wants this data to arrive form encoded. What Angular will do by default, if I just pass it an object here as the data to send along on the post, is it will JSON serialize that object, and that's not going to work for my /login endpoint. I need to form encode it. Fortunately, it's fairly easy to write a service that will take an object and put it into form encoded data. It can do that just by walking through each property that's available in that object and building a string of name equals value, so name value pairs, all properly encoded. And this service, which is just a function, should be able to take my object and put it in the correct format. All I need to do is inject that service. Of course, I'll also need to inject HTTP. So inject HTTP, inject form encode, and then form encode this data. And I also just need to be very explicit and tell Angular in the configuration parameter for this HTTP post that I need to set up the headers to include a header that specifies the content type as form encoded. So that is application /x-www-form URL encoded. And I pass along config to my HTTP post. And I might have something that gives me back an access token. So let's flip back over into the application and test this out. What I can do is watch the network tab, do a hard refresh. I can fill in a username and a password and click login. And in the network tab of the developer tools, I can see that I did a post to login and that it returned a 200 successful. That means I should have in my response an access token. So I sent the correct headers, I sent the correct form encoded data, the username and the password matched what the server expected. So now I have an access token. Now what I need to do in the next clip is save this access token, which is a long encrypted value, and I need to send it along on the request as an HTTP header so that I can get to the secret recipe, get that data, put it into a model, and display it on this view.